when dominant employers and taxpayers leave regions, these local economies tend to face economic distress. With the energy transition, we can see this coming.
How do we plan ahead? How do we ensure that resilience is a viable path with this energy transition happening?
You could put a solar farm on a facility that had a coal power plant, and it could be very productive from an energy standpoint. But that doesn't mean that the community is receiving the same taxes and the royalties.
How the energy transition's pace plays into ensure that these communities can maintain resilience. It is not as simple as just green jobs replace old jobs.
The resources may need to come from the federal government, but the solutions really should be driven by the communities themselves.
Hey there, everybody, and welcome to Power Perspectives. I'm Kinsey Grant Baker. Let's get into it. So there are three words I say in almost every episode of this little show: clean, reliable, affordable. Thanks to some very smart people, we are well on our way to a power future that is all of those things: clean, reliable, and affordable. But how we get from where we are today to that future, two paths diverged. Increasingly, we're seeing the major differences between economies built on fossil fuels and those built on renewables. Just as we're recording this episode, OpenAI, the de facto leader of the American-grown AI tech advantage, warned the White House that China is outbuilding, outplanning, and outdoing the United States in modern energy infrastructure, a reality that could threaten the US's pole position in AI with a so-called electron gap. Want to know what kind of energy infrastructure China's building? Renewables. Wind, solar, lots of it. In fact, China is currently building 510 gigawatts of utility-scale solar and wind capacity. That'll top off a massive 1,400 gigawatts already online, which is 5 times what's operating in the United States. Now, China is still a major emitter, no bones about it. But what's interesting to me is how China is building for a future more about renewables than fossil fuels. It's one example of a much larger conversation: the emergence and divergence of what we might call petrostates and electrostates, and how we ensure economic strength and stability no matter what kind of state. How might countries and communities built on fossil fuels stay competitive, resilient, and capable in a world built not on fossil fuels? The future of the energy economy is on the table, so let's talk about building resilient economies in the midst of the clean energy transition. I'm so excited to welcome our guest today. Noah Kaufman is an economist who has worked on energy and climate change policy in both the public and the private sectors. Under President Biden, Noah served as a senior economist at the Council of Economic Advisors. Under President Obama, he served as the Deputy Associate Director of Energy and Climate Change at the White House Council on Environmental Quality. He's an expert on topics like carbon pricing, the economic impacts of climate policies, and long-term decarbonization strategies. And he's now a senior research scholar at the Center on Global Energy Policy at Columbia. Noah, welcome to Power Perspectives. How are you today?
I'm doing great. I'm thrilled to be on, Kinsey. Thanks for having me, and thanks for that introduction.
Absolutely. I'm excited for our conversation. I think we've got a lot to dig into. I think I may have mentioned on the show before, I was briefly a politics major, briefly an econ major, eventually switched to journalism. So I'm going to really dig into the annals of history in my brain here to try to have some fun and figure out what comes next. Talk about resilience. I think we've got a lot of good stuff on tap here today. And we're going to get into more of the nitty gritty that I mentioned in that introduction, some of the core differences between petrostates, electrostates, the modern global economy, all that good stuff. But first, can you tell me a little bit more about your work and the Resilient Energy Economies Initiative? What's the mission and why was this created?
Sure, I'm happy to. So we are an interdisciplinary group of scholars. So the leadership team is with me at Columbia University, at Montana State University, at Notre Dame University, and at a think tank called Resources for the Future. But we have a network of scholars from all over the country, including many in fossil fuel dependent regions, working very closely with policymakers and practitioners, all with the goal of building more resilient local economies in places that are facing acute economic risks from a transition away from fossil fuels. So, in terms of why we're doing it, I'd say at this point we have loads of evidence that when dominant employers and taxpayers leave regions, these local economies tend to face prolonged periods of economic distress. with very detrimental impacts on the communities themselves. With the energy transition, we can see this coming now, right? We have hundreds, if not thousands, of communities across the country that depend on fossil fuel and related industries for high-paying jobs, for tax revenues that fund schools and other public services. So, unfortunately, we haven't done enough at this point to prepare for the decline of fossil fuels, and we don't necessarily have a playbook in place for policymakers looking to be more resilient to that transition. So that's why we exist. That's why our REE initiative is there to try to provide useful information to the policymakers and other decision makers who are looking to build that local resilience.
Yeah, it's really interesting, and I think what sets this apart from a lot of the other conversations that we've had on this show about building for the future is this idea that we know these changes are coming down the pike, right? We know that this energy transition is happening, and so to the extent that we can, how do we plan ahead? How do we ensure that resilience is a viable path for these communities is a really interesting conversation. So I want to, spend some time talking about that, but before we do, I think it might be helpful to almost work backwards just a little bit here. So when we're talking about, energy economies, no matter how they're built, or even just local economies themselves, regardless of how involved energy is in the big picture here, what does resilience look like? What are we working toward? And then we can talk about the path that it takes to get there. What does a resilient economy look like with regards to this energy transition happening?
To me, a resilient economy is one that can weather the shock of an industry or a big employer going away uh, with a minimum amount of pain, right? So that means they tend to have sufficiently diversified job opportunities and public revenue sources so that any single industry isn't going to be make or break for the community. So typically they also have, sufficient public services like transportation infrastructure. So, new businesses are able to be created and thrive. You mentioned planning. I think that's so key. Resilient communities have plans in place so that if things do go awry, they don't have to start from scratch at that time. And I think the problem is that a lot of the fossil fuel reliant communities across the country um, are not characterized by the list of factors that I just gave.
So when we're talking about these fossil fuel reliant communities across this country, specifically, and I think there's, a lot of this that could be applied, I'm sure, to the global landscape as well. But what is the core difference when it comes to fossil fuel reliant communities versus something that we would maybe categorize more in that like electro tech sort of a community or state? What are some of the key differentiators there in terms of technology, what's at stake, et cetera? Can you talk to me a little bit about how they look different?
It's really hard to generalize, as I'm sure right? It's like if you've seen one fossil fuel reliant community, you've seen one fossil fuel reliant community, right? It's going to be different when you think about any different community, but the type of challenges that we're talking about, it's really about geographic concentration of industries, right? So it's not unique to fossil fuels. It just so happens that we are in a country with major geographic concentration in fossil fuel production. So we're the biggest oil and gas producer in the world, one of the biggest coal producers in the world, and you think about our coal and something like 90% of the coal in our country comes from 20 or 30 counties across the country. So um, it's not a huge amount of people or land area, but in the places where that in these communities, it's a really big deal, right? That this is how they fund their schools. So I think that's how I would characterize it. Is that any community that relies very heavily on a specific industry, we're focused on fossil fuels because of the energy transition and because it is a bit unique that usually you don't have a crystal ball that says um, which industries are going to rise and fall, and frankly we don't here either, as we've seen in recent years. There's nothing smooth or predictable about the energy transition, but if we think we know the general way the world and the energy system is heading, we do have somewhat of a crystal ball, so we have the ability to plan for this transition in a way that maybe we haven't in the past.
Yeah, it's really compelling to think about, and to your point specifically about, no two fossil fuel reliant communities looking the same. It's interesting to think, a town in Texas where there's oil money, but there's also ERCOT, which is largely one of the, pioneers in terms of renewables and in all of the above energy strategy, versus a coal mining town in West Virginia. Those are two very different experiences, and the approach to ensuring that those communities and the economies within those communities can stay resilient, I imagine, is very different. Can you talk to me a little bit about what some of the approaches might be? When we're thinking about the toolkit for ensuring economic resilience, what are some of the plays in that playbook to extend this metaphor in a different sports related direction? What does that look like? What are some of the options that you have?
Yeah, well, you put that very well. I mean, there are fossil fuel communities that are already struggling today. There's places in Appalachia that have been struggling for 50 years, and matters have just been made worse as production has started to decline. And those look almost nothing like oil and gas producing community in West Texas, which may be doing okay today, right, along some dimensions, but just faces risks in the future. It's a different set of challenges, and it's certainly going to be a different set of solutions. Just from like the economic standpoint, a town that is already experiencing economic distress, you think of a toolbox that we would use for recessions, right? They might need economic stimulus to create jobs and economic activity, whereas that could be counterproductive in places, oil and gas boom towns right now. What they might need is help, you know, restructuring their economy so it's less reliant on a single industry going forward, which is just a different challenge. And it's always tempting, especially when you work on federal policy, like I have, to want more of a one size fits all solutions. And I think that's a lot of things that we have tried are tax credits for investments in disadvantaged communities. Um, but we've really seen a very limited success. And it shouldn't be surprising because again, these places are so different that unfortunately, if you've got hundreds of these communities, you probably do need hundreds of different solutions, and the solutions probably shouldn't come from the federal government, right? The resources may need to come from the federal government. So some help with capacity building may need to come from the federal government, but the solutions really should be driven by the communities themselves.
It's interesting to consider that we have a lot of excitement around the build out of energy transition technology, of clean energy. I mentioned at the beginning of this episode that clean, reliable, and affordable energy feels like it is going to happen. We are going to get there. We have the smartest minds working on solving this problem. And it's that feeling of momentum and excitement, but at the same time, it is not as simple as just green jobs replace old jobs. What else might that, entail in terms of how deep this goes? Can you paint the picture a little bit more for what that looks like for affected communities? Where sure there might be investment from some of these, interesting and innovative clean tech sort of startups or even, blue chip companies that are investing in green or clean tech. But it's not just that. So what else is it?
It's such an important point because part of my background is in energy systems modeling, and the way energy models work is, if you're looking at the energy transition, you're looking to replace the dirty megawatt hours with the clean megawatt hours, and you're trying to do it in the least cost way possible. So I've worked on a lot of these studies, and I'm sure you and your audience has seen them that shows, yeah, we can get rid of all the coal plants in our country and replace them with solar and wind and nuclear, and it will cost this many dollars per ton and that kind of thing. And I guess our work is tangential to that, right? Because what that misses are these local community impacts, things like job impacts and public revenue impacts. Because unfortunately, it is the exception when there are cases where there's a one-to-one match between sort of dirty energy and clean energy, right? Um, there's geographic mismatches, right? Where the places where, that are best suited for wind or solar or even battery manufacturing facilities aren't going to be the same places where fossil fuel production occurred. Um, there's mismatches related to the jobs themselves, the wages, the benefits. And I think an underrated issue are mismatches with public revenues, right? So you could put a solar farm on a facility that had a coal power plant, and it could be very productive from an energy standpoint, but that doesn't mean that the community is receiving the same, the severance taxes and the royalties and the property taxes and the income taxes and the sales taxes. It's all very different. So it's not necessarily a one-to-one shift. So I don't know. It's not that it doesn't happen, right? You can find examples. There is a town in Wyoming that has coal and gas power plants, and they're looking to build a nuclear power plant, and that kind of thing could maybe you can match up the job opportunities and the skill sets and the tax revenues that it works in these limited cases. But it really shouldn't be surprising that if you're thinking about like how do we succeed at local economic development, you want to cast a much wider net than just focusing on clean energy solutions, or sort of like a narrow green jobs framing. I think politicians love that framing from my experience in government. You heard President Biden say this all the time. Like when I think of climate, I think of jobs. Um, it sounds great, but this issue is quite a bit more complicated.
Yeah. Yeah. I'd love to hear your perspective on pacing in all of this. I mentioned at the beginning you've worked in a couple of different presidential administrations. We've been talking about this for a while, but it feels like the pace of energy transition, broadly speaking, it's variable. There are times where it feels like we're sprinting. There are times where it feels like we're sprinting and then we trip, which is how I might characterize the last 6 months. But there is this element of this conversation, especially that I am interested to hear your perspective on. The idea of, what we could, and I think are fairly categorized as fossil fuel gradualists, the people who say natural gas has a place in the energy transition. We have to walk before we can run. We have to crawl before we can walk. When we talk about the pace of change, where on one side of the spectrum there are those fossil fuel gradualists, and on the other side of the spectrum there's OpenAI saying build, 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 or else we're going to lose to China. Tell me a little bit more about how the energy transition's pace plays into planning to ensure that these communities can maintain resilience or to try to get ahead of the changes that we might be predicting down the line. Does timing and pacing factor into the work that you're doing?
It does. I think my answer is going to be not surprising at all, right? Faster transitions are more difficult than slower transitions. Bigger transitions are more difficult than smaller transitions. Transitions that you plan for are going to be smoother than ones that you don't. So it's tough because as you mentioned, there's a lot of competing priorities, and climate change impacts are real, and it's a real motivator for faster action. And now all the demands on the electricity system are a motivator for more and more generation of any kind. So it's definitely a difficult situation that policymakers are in to try to balance all these. But I think one thing we're trying to do is just highlight the importance of this issue, because I think a lot of times, especially from I come from probably more of the climate policy community, and sometimes the urgency of the issue overrides the importance of making sure that we are ensuring an equitable transition for these communities that could really be harmed if you go too fast.
Yeah, you gotta get from one place to the other, but you should probably wear your seatbelt, right? Like,
Right.
that's a fair reality. So I wanna talk some here too about, the data. You had a recent report, through Columbia, was analyzing the economic performance of US fossil fuel communities. Are there any highlights there that wanna share, that you wanna chat about, that you think are particularly interesting from some of the research that you've done?
What we found was that economic performance really tracks production trends in these communities. So when we went and we categorized communities based on their infrastructure, whether it's related to the coal industry or the oil and gas industry, what we found was as coal production has declined in the country over the last 10 or 20 years, economic performance in those communities has lagged. And the opposite for oil and gas communities have tended to outperform the national economy over the last couple of decades. On one hand, this shouldn't be surprising, but on the other hand, the fact that it's showing up in macroeconomic data for these regions and counties, um, is a little bit wild, right? We have an economic system that is supposed to be built on creative destruction, right? Where the vitality of our economy is supposed to be from letting industries rise and fall. Um, and what we're seeing, again, just because of the geographic concentration of um, production and the dominance that these industries have in certain communities, is the local economies can't necessarily survive the destruction of industries. So again, maybe not totally surprising, but I think it helps build the evidence base for the need to implement policies and planning going forward. One other thing that we found was data showing the importance of economic diversification in these communities. So when we looked at the places in the country where coal production had fallen the most, the ones that had more diversified economies beforehand tended to weather the production loss much better than the ones that didn't. So again, not surprising, but it sort of highlights the importance of economic diversification as a way to weather these losses in production. And maybe one other interesting thing, we didn't see the same level of impacts in communities where big power plants have closed. When coal mines close, you see major economic contractions. When coal power plants close, it's much harder to detect that from the data, at least the macroeconomic data. And there's a few different possible reasons for that. You know, power plants tend to be in more urban diversified places than coal mines. Um, Sometimes you have utilities that reallocate the jobs from power plants from one places to the other. But still, it's interesting because often you hear of power plants as sort of the story, when in fact it seems like the production side of things is where the bigger risks are.
Yeah, that's really interesting to me, especially in light of all of the headlines that we see lately about like nuclear power plant coming back online as a big boom to jobs, which
Mhm.
certainly I'm sure there is an impact, but that's a very compelling little tidbit there. One other thing that you mentioned that kind of stuck out to me there, you said that and again, a little bit of conjecture here, but we're on a podcast. What else are we gonna do? You mentioned that some of the oil and gas towns had outpaced some of the other parts of the country.
Mhm.
In a post-energy transition world, is there any indication as to what the oil and gas town of the future might be? Is there any element of the energy transition where you say there's a ton of economic, viability here? This will create more diversity within local economies. Is it solar? Is it wind? Is it something else? Do you have any indication to what that might be, that replacement?
I'm going to continue to refuse to generalize because it's just
That's
so
fair.
hard and these
That's fair.
communities are so different. You know, we think of oil and gas production booming in this country because we are setting records, it seems like every year. But if you look at sort of the landscape around the country of oil and gas producing counties, some of them are booming. Some of them production has been steady. In almost half of them, we found production has actually declined over the last couple decades, and you see this these trends in economic performance, even sort of digging into oil and gas themselves. So the places where oil and gas is booming are doing very well. The places where oil and gas production is declining, start to look more like we think about coal communities where coal production has declined. And I would just go back to what are the opportunities in your community? Like I was in a place couple of years ago in Western Colorado, Rangeley, Colorado, a small town that was really created because of the oil boom after World War II. And it's a very nice town with a community college and, from what I could tell, good public services and restaurants and all that, almost entirely funded by the oil industry today. Not necessarily with jobs, but the public revenue to fund their critical public services comes from the industry. The risks are existential in places like that. And it's really hard to imagine. I mean, people are really creative and entrepreneurial, and I'm sure there's lots of other businesses that can pop up, but we're talking about a huge export industry for, in a lot of cases, a small town. So it's very hard to imagine some places fully replacing that. They're really going to have to reimagine themselves.
Yeah. And to any extent that we can avoid doing again what was done to certain parts of Appalachia, there is no question to me that we should be taking steps to ensure that that doesn't happen, that these, communities and certain swaths of the country are not left with nothing. It's of course we should be thinking about this. Which brings me to my next question, which is how, specifically an audience listening to this episode, which is largely utility professionals, you mentioned some parts about, the power plants and what happens there in terms of generation versus the plants themselves. But how else should utility professionals be thinking about this to ensure that, yeah, their jobs stay jobs? Number two, also that we have that clean, reliable, affordable future. But number three, that the communities in which they operate, the communities that make up their territory, their service territory, are resilient. What might these professionals be thinking about right now, doing right now, prioritizing right now?
It's a good question. The obvious thing that we keep coming back to is planning, right? The To the extent you have more successful transitions, it tends to be because there was a long period where a plan was put into place, not just any plan, but a good plan with community buy-in. And a lot of times you just don't have that. If you have facilities shutting down and staying idle for years and years while places figure out what to do about them, I would say there's a lot of utilities that do a good job looking out for their workers, um, looking out for the ratepayers. But this is as you said, this is a community issue, right? So I would just encourage utilities when they can to think about their workers and their ratepayers as members of communities also that rely on whether it's a power plant or other type of facility um, for revenues and just think about the broader community impacts of any decisions. I think it's hard because utilities also have to worry about their investors, which is why I tend to think this is a policy problem. And that's something utilities can help with also is to, utilities tend to be powerful voices in policy conversations. So playing a productive role in helping policymakers put in place efforts to encourage equitable transitions is a good thing. Certainly not standing in the way of those processes would be a good first step.
Yeah, and so often when I speak with utility leaders, they're talking about ways to create a relationship, create a rapport with the end customer, and not just the businesses, not just the data centers, but the people who are paying their bills at the end of every month, to create another touch point with them outside of that bill, because that really is for so many people the only indication of a relationship that you have with your utility is how much they take out of your debit account at the end of the month. And maybe this is a way to create that additional storytelling opportunity, that additional element of a relationship that might be missing for a lot of the utility pros listening to this right now. I'm wondering if there are any positive examples of communities, state level policymakers, utilities even, that might be doing this well. Do you have anything that you can point to say this is how this should be done? This is as close as we can get to a blueprint for something that is, no universal solution.
I'll say we're moving in the right direction because 10 years ago, it was really hard to even have these conversations. So economists, where I come from, historically have really been skeptical of any kind of scale community support. Economists have tended to support just helping people wherever they are and not helping specific communities. And because of that, policymakers have historically not done a whole lot in terms of focusing on economic development in struggling communities. And I think that's starting to change in large part due to the very clear effects of globalization and hollowing out of manufacturing towns across the country. I think this idea that regional inequalities will kind of go away by themselves because people will move and firms will locate where jobs are, labor is cheap. We just have enough evidence now that that's not the case, that I think this has become unavoidable. And you really saw this in the Biden administration, where there was more of a focus on place based economic policy. People talk about just transitions, but a lot of those conversations historically have been very high level, um, conceptual. They've tended to sort of focus on the small nature of, I can't tell you how many times people will say, "Oh, there's only 40,000 coal miners in the country. We could just pay their salaries and be done with it." Right. And not only would that not be effective at all for these communities, but I think it's pretty offensive to people in these communities that this is how they would be treated. So that's starting to change also. Right. I think um, during the Biden administration and sort of major legislation that was passed in 2021 and 2022, really unprecedented support was provided for struggling communities and fossil fuel reliant communities specifically. So we have an interesting experiment going on, and some of those policies are going away now, but at least for a few years they were in place, where hopefully we'll learn a whole lot more about what has been working well and what isn't working. And some of our work at Columbia is focused on that too. At the state level, you have some interesting experiments. Colorado has a just transition office focused on communities transitioning away from coal. The state of New Mexico passed an Energy Transition Act 5 or 6 years ago now. A few different funds focused on community economic development to move away from oil, gas, and coal production. There aren't a whole lot of major success stories of look how um, we triumphed in this transition away from our major industry. I'd say I think we're not ignoring the problem anymore. Maybe one pitch I will give your listeners. Um, there's this great podcast called Reimagine Rural by Tony Pippa of the Brookings Institute, where he goes to different towns across the country, rural places, and talks about how they are reimagining their communities. And it's always really inspiring and creative. So, um, again, it's hard to generalize, but I always find it great to hear the specific individual stories about what a town in Pennsylvania or West Virginia is doing to move forward. Again, it's really hard to generalize, but I do think it is interesting when you look at the experiences of a place like Germany that has a history of, especially with coal production, certain parts of the country are very historically reliant on coal, but they have a very different system in Germany. They have a different safety net, they have a different planning process. Their sort of vocational training is different. And they put in place a plan decades ago to phase out their coal production and their nuclear production. That's sort of a whole separate story. As part of that, there are large scale investments in the coal dependent regions in the country. And again, it's not like a total success story, but it's led to redevelopment in a way that you just haven't seen in places coal dependent regions in the United States. So I do think there's a lot we can learn. Another even weirder example is actually Dubai. So UAE, which I think everybody sort of thinks of as just sort of a petrostate still, and it very much is. But Dubai specifically was a big oil producing emirate that basically ran out of oil, as far as I understand it, and with the help of the country and diversification efforts, as I'm sure you all know, Dubai is now sort of a hub of finance and tourism. So, you do have interesting stories of places moving beyond fossil fuels when they have planning and resources and capacity that they need.
Yeah, it's really interesting, especially in light of the conversations that are happening in tech and in policy right now about this. However you want to characterize it, how they're characterizing it is a heated competition with China over leadership in tech specifically. So much of it is just they're building faster than the United States is building. And I am curious if they are building for a future that is, you know, equitable for all people whose jobs might change. As I mentioned, they remain a very significant emitter, and certainly use a good deal of fossil fuels, but fossil fuel use is down because renewables are an increasingly important and large portion of demand in China. Um, do we
Yeah,
know how they're doing?
there's definitely overlap between you mentioned sort of the petrostate, electrostate framework. There's overlap between those, which I think of as like national industrial policy strategies and local community development strategies. But I do think these are somewhat separate issues. And with China, China, who I think of as like the emerging electro state, I would say they're certainly succeeding over the last decade. As you know, you gave some eye-popping numbers about, how they're building out solar and batteries and wind. I think a lot of what the Biden administration was doing was to try to play catch up in those industries and building out those manufacturing bases domestically here as well. But again, that's going to be only a limited solution at the community level because you can succeed if you're the United States and China at building out these new industries. But that doesn't necessarily mean you won't leave a whole lot of communities behind. I mean, I think the good thing if you're United States or you're China is that you're such a big economy with so many resources that you can sort of successfully transition and provide communities with the resources that they need in a way that like your classical petrostate might not be able to. Um, but you still have to want to do that.
It's an interesting way to, kind of wrap up the conversation. We started chatting about China and that's how we'll finish it. No, this has been really, really insightful for me. If you're down, we'll do a quick lightning round, rapid fire questions.
Sure, I can do
All
my
right.
best. Yeah.
Sweet. So, you mentioned, or I mentioned before, that you have a good deal of experience in the political arena. Energy, increasingly a political topic, as we all know. Is there anything when it comes to energy that you feel can keep us united? What's something that people agree on, if there's anything?
I do think that the trend towards energy affordability and you know even abundance is bringing sort of strange coalitions together these days, right? And it's not um, necessarily fully aligned with the goals of climate action or equitable transitions, but I do think there's progress to be made on energy issues because you have so much somewhat unusual coalitions understanding, oh yeah, we can't have electricity prices as high as they are. We can't have years and years that it takes to build new infrastructure. So um, I've been at least somewhat hopeful that politicians have recognized this and are starting to move towards solutions along those lines.
When Ezra Klein starts talking about energy abundance, that's when we know we're as close as we can get. I'm just kidding.
Right.
Um, so, next question: what is something that gives you hope about the future of the energy economy?
It's got to be technology, right? I think the policy landscape is fairly depressing from my perspective right now. But one thing that seems to continue to march forward is technological progress. So I think hopefully that will continue. We are in an entirely different place now than we were 20 or 30 years ago because of the advances that we've made in technologies like solar and batteries. So hopefully we can repeat those and make energy technologies cheaper and more widely available to everybody.
Yes. Thank you to the tech people who are figuring this out. Not my job, and I appreciate the work that you're doing. So my last question here for you: do you have any predictions, bold predictions, hot take adjacent takes about the next couple years in energy? Anything that you're predicting that maybe we're not talking about enough?
I'll throw something out so I'll stick with climate policy, which I'm most familiar with. I think you're going to see a return of a lot of discussion of clean energy standards in the next couple years. I think right now a lot of the climate clean energy discussions have either gone away or it's been all about sort of a defense posture against what the Trump administration is doing. But I think eventually you're going to see more proactive proposals, at least, if not action. And I think policymakers are going to find that we're in an economic environment where big fiscal spending, like the subsidies of the Inflation Reduction Act, is not going to be so viable anymore. Carbon pricing policies that explicitly raise energy prices are probably not going to be viable anytime soon. So what you have left then are clean energy standards that sort of gradually encourage, a transition away from carbon intensive production at a lower cost to consumers, at least, and at, no cost to the government. So I wouldn't be surprised to see more clean energy standard talk.
All right. I will look forward to it, and maybe we'll have to have you back on, Noah, when that conversation continues to heat up. So thank you so much for the time today. It has been a real joy. I know that some of what we're talking about is not the most joyful, but it has been a joy for me to be able to revisit some of the things I loved learning about in college in my environmental econ classes, and now we get to talk about it in our day jobs, which is really cool for me. So thank you for affording me that opportunity and for sharing all this information with our audience. It's been really, really insightful, and I appreciate your time.
Thanks so much. It's great to be on.